Centuries later, their ways of surviving may seem simple, even boring. But to them, these quiet strategies were the very difference between life and death, the cycle of the seasons. From the first thaw of spring to the bleak grey of winter, medieval survival was dictated by the land. Peasants rose with the sun, worked by its light, and planned their lives around the growing cycle of crops. Grain, especially rye, wheat, barley, and oats, was the backbone of existence. Without it, bread could not be made, and without bread, hunger loomed. In good years, the harvest filled barns and cellars with sacks of grain. Families knew that if they rationed carefully, there might be enough to carry them through the leaner months. But in poor years, when rains rotted crops or frosts came too soon, famine cast its shadow across entire villages. The people of medieval Europe were painfully aware of this uncertainty, and so they developed methods, quiet, careful techniques to stretch food further and to endure what they called the hungry gap. The hungry gap was dreaded. Bellies ached. Children cried for food, and adults often tightened their belts so the little ones might have more during these months. Survival meant finding substitutes, wild greens, roots, and sometimes foods that were barely edible. People turned to nettles, sorrel, and dandelion leaves, bitter plants that could be boiled into soups. They dug in the hedgerows for wild garlic and leeks, and when meat was impossible to find, they trapped small animals, rabbits, birds, even squirrels. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be spared, preserving the harvest when times were better. Peasants worked with quiet determination to preserve as much as possible. Without refrigerators or modern canning methods, they relied on techniques that seem almost forgotten today. Grain was stored in wooden bins, sometimes lined with clay to keep out pests. Meat, when it could be obtained, often from slaughtering livestock in late autumn, was salted heavily or smoked over slow fires. The smell of wood smoke was not just the fragrance of daily life, it was the scent of survival. Fish, too, was salted or dried in the sun. Even the humble herring, traded in vast quantities, became a staple food across Europe. A barrel of salted fish could mean the difference between starving and enduring. Fruits and vegetables were dried or turned into thick pastes. Apples were sliced thin and left to dry in the air. Beans and peas were harvested and kept in sacks to last the winter. Cabbages, hardy and resilient, were buried in cool earth pits to remain edible for months. Each of these tasks was dull, repetitive, and unromantic. Yet they were as vital as any knight's sword or king's decree. Without them, entire families would perish in the cold. Bread. The center of survival at the heart of all this was bread. To the medieval peasant, bread was not a side dish. It was life itself. A poor harvest of grain was not merely an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. Most bread eaten by peasants was coarse and dark, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with oats. White bread made from finely sifted wheat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Yet even coarse bread gave the strength to work the fields, to chop firewood, and to endure. In times of shortage, people stretched bread with fillers. Bran, ground beans, chestnuts, and even sawdust in desperate times. Such bread was heavy, bitter, and sometimes harmful to the stomach. But when the alternative was nothing, people ate what they had. Winter hardships, winter brought its own trials. Once the ground froze, fresh crops were impossible to gather. If the stores were empty, families faced hunger with no choice but to endure. Cold, damp cottages with little insulation meant fires had to burn constantly. Wood was precious, sometimes too precious. Families rationed their fuel just as they rationed their food. Clothing, too, was often inadequate. Wool cloaks and rough-spun garments gave some protection, but winters were long and harsh. Frostbite, illness, and exhaustion claimed many lives before spring returned. And yet, peasants did not simply suffer in silence. They developed habits, customs, and small but ingenious ways to survive the cold. Straw was packed into bedding for insulation. Animals were sometimes kept inside cottages at night, not only for safety, but for warmth. Communal survival. One overlooked truth of medieval life was the role of the community. Peasants did not survive alone. Villagers often shared food during shortages. Neighbors helped each other gather firewood, repair cottages, or slaughter livestock. The church, too, played a role. Monasteries stored grain, sometimes distributing it to the poor in times of famine. Though often stretched thin, charity provided at least some relief. Festivals and gatherings, though small, also helped. They gave people a sense of connection, of being part of something larger than their hunger and hardships. Shared rituals, even singing together during Lent or Advent, created strength that was not only physical but emotional. Small strategies, great significance. But when we look back at these techniques, drying apples, smoking meat, boiling nettles into soup, they may seem insignificant, but each was an act of quiet resilience. The medieval peasant did not write books, lead armies, or carve their names into stone monuments. Their contribution was simpler to endure, to keep their families alive year after year. And yet, one must wonder, what happened when even these survival strategies failed? What did a peasant do when famine stretched not for weeks, but for years? When no nettles could be gathered, when no neighbors had food to share, and when hunger became not an inconvenience, but a crisis.
To prevent the worst collapse. The idea of storage was not new, but after the great famines, it became central to survival thinking. Food was no longer just a harvest to be eaten. It was a lifeline to be guarded for the years to come. Crop rotation and better farming. Medieval peasants also learned to manage the soil more carefully. The old two-field system, where one field was planted and another left fallow, gave way to the three-field system. With this method, one field held winter crops, another spring crops, and the third lay resting. Each year, the cycle shifted, ensuring the soil did not exhaust itself. This may sound like a dull agricultural adjustment, yet it transformed survival. More land could be planted, more food could be grown, and famine, while never erased, became slightly less likely. Oxen and horses were also harnessed more effectively, with padded collars that allowed them to pull heavier plows. These changes, combined with new tools like the heavy-wheeled plow, expanded the land that could be cultivated, even the tough clay soils of northern Europe. The result was not abundance, but a fragile improvement, enough to keep villages alive in times when famine once would have destroyed them. The rise of fish and salt. Another quiet adaptation was the expansion of preserved foods. Fish, in particular, became central to diets across Europe. Herring, salted and shipped in barrels, could feed families far from the sea. Salt itself became one of the most valuable commodities of the age, a mineral so essential that towns and trade routes grew wealthy on its movement. By investing in these trades, communities gave themselves a buffer against local harvest failures. If grain was scarce, salted fish or dried meat could carry them through. This meant that survival was no longer only local. It was connected, bound up in trade, transport, and the careful storage of goods from far away. Religious and cultural responses. Survival was not just practical. It was also spiritual. The church taught that famine was both a punishment and a test. But over time, it also embraced the role of guardian. Monasteries kept food stores. Monks experimented with herbs, brewing medicines and tonics to keep communities healthy. Pilgrimages to holy sites became more common after famines, as people sought divine protection against hunger. Saints were invoked to bless the fields. Rogation days, special processions through farmland, asked God for fertile soil and good weather. Even if these rituals did not change the weather, they gave people structure and hope. In times of uncertainty, that hope was as essential as bread. Oral memory and stories. The lessons of famine were also carried in memory. Parents told children how hard the hungry years had been. Grandparents warned against waste, against careless eating, against forgetting that life could change overnight. Songs, prayers, and even proverbs kept this memory alive. One saying went, "Waste not in times of plenty, lest you starve in times of want." Simple words, yet they carried the weight of centuries of hunger. These memories shaped behavior. Food was valued not as a luxury, but as a fragile gift. And even when times improved, peasants rarely forgot the years when every crumb mattered. The quiet strength of community. Perhaps the greatest survival technique was not in the fields, nor in the barns, but in the bonds between people. Famine had shown that no family could endure alone. Neighbors helped neighbors. Villages shared burdens. When one family had bread and another had none, it was expected, sometimes demanded, that the loaf would be divided. To refuse might mean that in another year, when fortune reversed, no help would come. This unwritten rule of survival, born of hardship, created webs of obligation. They were not always fair, but they kept the village alive. The long shadow of scarcity. Even centuries later, the shadow of famine never entirely faded. The Black Death of the mid-14th century would strike down millions. But even then, the memory of hunger influenced how survivors responded. Land was redistributed. Wages were demanded. Food was still seen as the anchor of life, more reliable than wealth or power. And for the ordinary peasant, survival remained the same daily practice. To store grain, to smoke meat, to dry apples in the sun, to plant, to harvest, to share. It is easy to overlook these details in the sweep of history. They are not heroic deeds. They are not written in gilded manuscripts. They are, instead, the unglamorous persistence of people who simply refused to vanish. Echoes in the modern world today. We live in a time when food is, for many, abundant. supermarkets overflow with choices. Fresh fruit arrives from across the world, no matter the season. Refrigerators hum quietly in our kitchens, keeping food safe for weeks. And yet, echoes of the medieval struggle remain. When natural disasters strike, when wars disrupt supply chains, when prices soar, we feel, for a moment, the fragility that peasants knew every day. We still salt meat, we still dry fruit, we still preserve food in jars, not just for flavor, but as a reminder of older wisdom. Farmers still rotate crops, still protect the soil, still watch the skies for signs of rain or drought. The medieval peasant may seem far removed from us, yet in every loaf of bread, in every stored jar of beans, in every winter pantry, their survival habits whisper through time. A final reflection. In the end, the hidden wisdom of peasants was not in grand inventions or glorious victories. It was in their quiet endurance, in their ability to take hunger, frost, and endless uncertainty and turn them into rituals of survival. They lived by rhythms we often forget: the turning of the seasons, the gathering of harvests, the storing of grain, and, always, the knowledge that famine could return at any time. Perhaps their greatest gift to us is not the memory of their suffering, but the reminder that survival depends not on wealth or glory, but on preparation, community, and resilience in the face of hardship. So we might ask ourselves, in a world of abundance, have we forgotten too much of their wisdom? And if another season of hunger were to come, would we be ready, as they were, to endure? So we might ask ourselves, in a world of abundance, have we forgotten too much of their wisdom? And if another season of hunger were to come, would we be ready, as they were, to endure? Animals through the winter, spoiled in sodden heaps. For peasants who depended on the harvest, there was no safety net. The barns were empty, the cellars bare. Smoke rose from chimneys, but only to warm families with little to eat. Bread, when it could be baked at all, was stretched with weeds, bark, and ground acorns. Hunger gnawed at every stomach. Children weakened, the elderly fell ill. And across villages and towns, people whispered, not of kings or saints, but of how long their bodies could endure. The price of food. As grain grew scarce, its price soared. What once might buy enough flour for a family could now purchase only a handful. The wealthy bought what they could, but even their tables grew thin. For peasants, survival meant selling possessions, begging for scraps, or taking to the roads in search of relief. Chroniclers noted how families sold tools, land, and even their clothing to buy bread. Some parents, faced with impossible choices, gave their children away to monasteries, not out of cruelty but in the desperate hope that monks or nuns could feed them. The famine blurred the lines of society. Lords who once demanded rents in grain found their peasants unable to pay. Whole villages collapsed, their people scattered or dead. Desperate substitutes. In ordinary years, peasants had relied on nettles, beans, and dried fish to survive the hungry gap. But during the Great Famine, even these substitutes were gone. Wild plants were stripped bare. Rivers yielded little. The forests, once teeming with rabbits and birds, grew silent from overhunting. So people turned to what they would normally never consider. Reports describe bread made from ground peas mixed with moss, porridge boiled with the bark of trees. Cats, dogs, and even horses, once too valuable to kill, were eaten. The chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that many poor people ate things unfit for human consumption, roots of grasses and trees. He noted with quiet horror that bodies of the dead were sometimes dug up in graveyards by those too weak to resist temptation. Whether such accounts were entirely true or exaggerated, the desperation was undeniable. Ordinary survival strategies had broken down. What remained was endurance at the very edge of human possibility. Disease and weakness. Hunger did not come alone. Weakened bodies became easy prey for illness. typhoid, dysentery, and fevers spread quickly through villages. With little food to fight infection, many who might have survived in better times perished. The famine of 1315 to 1317 was followed by waves of sickness. Mortality rose. In some regions, it is estimated that 1 in 10 people died. In others, whole communities vanished from records, as if swallowed by the hunger. Children were the most vulnerable. Many who survived the famine grew up stunted in height and frail in health. Their shortened lives became a living reminder of those years of suffering. Psychological weight. To live through famine was not merely to be hungry. It was to endure despair. For medieval people, every misfortune carried a spiritual meaning. Was God punishing them? Had sin brought down the endless rain? Priests preached repentance, but repentance did not fill empty stomachs. Songs and tales from the time speak of hunger as a shadow, a relentless enemy. To peasants who had so little already, famine was not just deprivation. It was the collapse of all that kept life predictable. The small routines of survival, storing cabbages, drying beans, salting fish, were suddenly meaningless. Even today, it is hard to grasp the constant anxiety of those years. Every sunrise brought the same question: would there be food that day? Small acts of resistance. And yet, even in famine, people found ways to resist despair. Communities shared what little they had. Some lords forgave rents for a season, allowing peasants to keep what they could find. In towns, guilds organized food relief, distributing bread to the poor. Charity became more than a religious act. It was survival woven into the fabric of society. Without it, the losses would have been far worse. In villages, people gathered together, singing hymns, telling stories, clinging to the rhythm of the calendar. They observed holy days even when there was no feast to eat, because rituals gave structure when survival seemed impossible. The lessons of famine. When the rains finally ceased and harvests began to recover, survivors carried with them new habits of caution. Fields were sown more carefully. Food was stored with greater urgency. Communities built granaries and encouraged the church to keep reserves for the poor. But the memory of hunger lingered. Those who had lived through famine spoke of it to their children and their children to the next generation. In some villages, tales of those hungry years were told for centuries. It is easy to overlook these boring details: how moss was ground into bread, how nettles were boiled into thin soup, how a single salted fish could keep a family alive for days. Yet these are the very details that reveal resilience. Survival was not glorious. It was quiet, painful, and unrelenting. The unanswered question. As we reflect on this era, one question remains. How did ordinary people, after enduring such famine, prepare themselves for the next disaster? Did the memory of hunger truly shield them from future trials? Or did history repeat itself again and again in cycles of scarcity and suffering? Section 3. Lasting Lessons of Survival. The famine years eventually passed, but their memory lingered. For those who had lived through hunger, the question was no longer only how to survive the present. It was how to prepare for the future. Peasants, lords, and even kings began to understand that survival required more than luck. It required foresight, planning, and above all, resilience built into every season of life. Granaries and collective storage. One of the most important lessons was the value of stored food. Across Europe, communities began to invest more heavily in granaries. Strong, raised structures built of stone or timber, where sacks of grain could be protected from moisture, pests, and thieves. In some villages, communal granaries were established, overseen by the church or by local lords. These acted as early insurance systems. When harvests failed, the grain held in reserve could be distributed to the poor. not always enough to prevent hunger, but enough to prevent the worst collapse. The idea of storage was not new, but after the great famines, it became central to survival thinking. Food was no longer just a harvest to be eaten. It was a lifeline to be guarded for the years to come. Crop rotation and better farming. Medieval peasants also learned to manage the soil more carefully. The old two-field system, where one field was planted and another left fallow, gave way to the three-field system. With this method, one field held winter crops, another spring crops, and the third lay resting. Each year, the cycle shifted, ensuring the soil did not exhaust itself. This may sound like a dull agricultural adjustment, yet it transformed survival. More land could be planted, more food could be grown, and famine, while never erased, became slightly less likely. Oxen and horses were also harnessed more effectively, with padded collars that allowed them to pull heavier plows. These changes, combined with new tools like the heavy-wheeled plow, expanded the land that could be cultivated, even the tough clay soils of northern Europe. The result was not abundance, but a fragile improvement, enough to keep villages alive in times when famine once would have destroyed them. The rise of fish and salt. Another quiet adaptation was the expansion of preserved foods. Fish, in particular, became central to diets across Europe. Herring, salted and shipped in barrels, could feed families far from the sea. Salt itself became one of the most valuable commodities of the age, a mineral so essential that towns and trade routes grew wealthy on its movement. By investing in these trades, communities gave themselves a buffer against local harvest failures. If grain was scarce, salted fish or dried meat could carry them through. This meant that survival was no longer only local. It was connected, bound up in trade, transport, and the careful storage of goods from far away. Religious and cultural responses. Survival was not just practical. It was also spiritual. The church taught that famine was both a punishment and a test. But over time, it also embraced the role of guardian. Monasteries kept food stores. Monks experimented with herbs, brewing medicines and tonics to keep communities healthy. Pilgrimages to holy sites became more common after famines, as people sought divine protection against hunger. Saints were invoked to bless the fields. Rogation days, special processions through farmland, asked God for fertile soil and good weather. Even if these rituals did not change the weather, they gave people structure and hope. In times of uncertainty, that hope was as essential as bread. Oral memory and stories. The lessons of famine were also carried in memory. Parents told children how hard the hungry years had been. Grandparents warned against waste, against careless eating, against forgetting that life could change overnight. Songs, prayers, and even proverbs kept this memory alive. One saying went, "Waste not in times of plenty, lest you starve in times of want." Simple words, yet they carried the weight of centuries of hunger. These memories shaped behavior. Food was valued not as a luxury, but as a fragile gift. And even when times improved, peasants rarely forgot the years when every crumb mattered. The quiet strength of community. Perhaps the greatest survival technique was not in the fields, nor in the barns, but in the bonds between people. Famine had shown that no family could endure alone. Neighbors helped neighbors. Villages shared burdens. When one family had bread and another had none, it was expected, sometimes demanded, that the loaf would be divided. To refuse might mean that in another year, when fortune reversed, no help would come. This unwritten rule of survival, born of hardship, created webs of obligation. They were not always fair, but they kept the village alive. The long shadow of scarcity. Even centuries later, the shadow of famine never entirely faded. The Black Death of the mid-14th century would strike down millions, but even then, The memory of hunger influenced how survivors responded. Land was redistributed. Wages were demanded. Food was still seen as the anchor of life, more reliable than wealth or power. And for the ordinary peasant, survival remained the same daily practice: to store grain, to smoke meat, to dry apples in the sun, to plant, to harvest, to share. It is easy to overlook these details in the sweep of history. They are not heroic deeds. They are not written in gilded manuscripts. They are, instead, the unglamorous persistence of people who simply refused to vanish. Echoes in the modern world today. We live in a time when food is, for many, abundant. Supermarkets overflow with choices. Fresh fruit arrives from across the world, no matter the season. Refrigerators hum quietly in our kitchens, keeping food safe for weeks. And yet, echoes of the medieval struggle remain. When natural disasters strike, when wars disrupt supply chains, when prices soar, we feel, for a moment, the fragility that peasants knew every day. We still salt meat, we still dry fruit, we still preserve food in jars, not just for flavor, but as a reminder of older wisdom. Farmers still rotate crops, still protect the soil, still watch the skies for signs of rain or drought. The medieval peasant may seem far removed from us, yet in every loaf of bread, in every stored jar of beans, in every winter pantry, their survival habits whisper through time. A final reflection. In the end, the hidden wisdom of peasants was not in grand inventions or glorious victories. It was in their quiet endurance, in their ability to take hunger, frost, and endless uncertainty and turn them into rituals of survival. They lived by rhythms we often forget: the turning of the seasons, the gathering of harvests, the storing of grain, and always the knowledge that famine could return at any time. Perhaps their greatest gift to us is not the memory of their suffering, but the reminder that survival depends not on wealth or glory, but on preparation, community, and resilience in the face of hardship. So we might ask ourselves, in a world of abundance, have we forgotten too much of their wisdom? And if another season of hunger were to come, would we be ready, as they were, to endure? Foundation of cooking, cleaning, farming, and craft. Medieval villages were often built near water. A stream might run through the center of a settlement, providing water for people and animals alike. Buckets, carved from wood or lined with iron, were lowered into wells day after day, bringing up the clear, cold water that sustained families. But water was not only carried in buckets. Ingenious systems of channels and ditches, simple but effective, diverted streams to fields. These irrigation methods, rarely recorded in chronicles, meant that crops had a better chance of surviving dry summers. Without them, a harvest might wither before the sickle could cut it. The mill, turning water into power. Perhaps the most remarkable use of water in the medieval world was the water mill. To us, a turning wheel splashing in a stream may seem quaint, but to the people of the Middle Ages, it was a revolution. Grain, the backbone of survival, had to be ground into flour. Doing this by hand with quernstones was exhausting and slow. A family might spend hours grinding enough for a single day's bread, but a mill could grind sacks of grain in far less time. The water wheel turned with steady force, driving gears and millstones inside. Villages clustered around mills, because they represented the difference between backbreaking labor and a steady supply of flour. It was not only grain. Mills pressed oil, sawed wood, and hammered metal. They gave peasants a small but vital edge in the endless struggle against hunger and hardship. Fire, the heat of survival. If water sustained life, fire defended it. Fire cooked food, warmed cottages, and protected against the chill of winter nights. Without fire, survival in much of medieval Europe would have been impossible. The hearth stood at the center of every home. Smoke curled upward, sometimes through a chimney, sometimes simply through a hole in the roof. Around the fire, families cooked thick stews. Beans, peas, and cabbage simmered in iron cauldrons. Bread was baked on hot stones or in clay ovens heated with wood. Fire also preserved food. Meat was smoked slowly over glowing embers. Fish was dried above flames until it could be stored for months. Even dairy could be transformed into cheese beside the warmth of the hearth. But fire was not without danger. Whole villages could be consumed in a single blaze. Roofs thatched with straw caught fire easily. A moment of carelessness could mean disaster. And so people learned a delicate balance, to use fire as a tool, but to respect its power. Charcoal and metalwork. From fire also came the ability to shape tools. Ordinary wood burned hot, but not hot enough to forge iron. So peasants and smiths turned wood into charcoal, blackened, brittle, but burning with intense heat. In the glow of charcoal fires, iron was hammered into plowshares, knives, and nails. These were not luxuries. They were survival. A sharp plow meant deeper furrows. A sturdy knife meant safer meals. Nails held cottages together against the wind. Every spark that flew from the blacksmith's hammer carried the weight of survival. Without tools, the soil could not be tilled, and food could not be harvested. Without tools, cottages would collapse, and mills would stand silent. Stone, the strength of shelter. Finally, there was stone. Unlike wood, which rotted and burned, stone endured. It was heavy, hard to shape, and costly to build with. But once in place, it could last for centuries. Peasants lived mostly in timber cottages. But for churches, bridges, and sometimes village ovens, stone was the material of choice. A stone bridge might save a community from isolation in winter floods. A stone oven might allow bread to be baked for dozens of families. In towns and cities, stone walls rose, not just to defend against enemies, but to give people a sense of permanence in a fragile world. Even the simplest stone foundation under a cottage offered protection against damp ground and flooding. To us, these structures may look plain, even boring. But to those who built them, each stone laid was an act of faith in survival. The balance of elements. Water gave movement. Fire gave warmth. Stone gave strength. Together they formed the quiet backbone of medieval survival. Without mills, peasants would have spent endless hours grinding grain by hand. Without fire, winters would have been unbearable, and food impossible to preserve. Without stone, bridges would collapse, and cottages would sink into the mud. It was not glory or grandeur. It was ordinary engineering, simple, repetitive, and utterly essential. A thought left hanging. But as much as these techniques sustained life, they also carried risks. What happened when the river ran dry? When fire turned from friend to enemy? When stone walls built to protect became prisons during siege and famine? Section 2. When lifelines turned against them. For medieval people, survival was never simple. The same elements that gave life, water, fire, and stone, could just as easily bring ruin. It was a delicate balance, one that could shift without warning. Peasants and townsfolk lived with constant awareness that what sustained them might also betray them. The river that turned the mill could flood. The fire that warmed the hearth could burn down the cottage. The stone wall that offered protection might trap them inside during siege. Survival was never guaranteed, not even with the cleverest of engineering. Water in flood and drought. A flowing stream was a blessing until the rains came. Villages built close to rivers for convenience often paid the price when waters rose. Floods swept away fields, drowned livestock, and filled cottages with mud. Grain stores spoiled, and families were forced to abandon homes. Chroniclers recorded devastating floods across Europe. In 1315, during the same years that famine struck, heavy rains turned farmland into swamps. Villages watched helplessly as their wheat and rye disappeared beneath standing water. Yet, droughts were no kinder. In years when the rain failed, streams dried to trickles. Mills stood still, irrigation ditches emptied, crops withered in parched fields. Without water, food could not grow. So water, both too much and too little, constantly tested medieval survival. Ingenious though their channels and mills were, they could not command the skies. The peril of fire was the heart of every home, but it was also its greatest danger. A spark could leap from the hearth, land on dry straw, and within minutes an entire cottage might be in flames. Thatched roofs, wooden beams, and tightly packed houses in towns created perfect fuel for disaster. Once one building caught fire, it spread rapidly to others. People carried buckets from wells, forming desperate chains to douse the flames. But often their efforts were too small against the roaring blaze. Records tell of entire towns destroyed. In London, in 1135, a massive fire consumed much of the city. In smaller villages, fires were so common that many families lived with the fear that everything they had built might vanish overnight. To lose a house was not merely to lose shelter. It meant losing stored grain, preserved food, tools, and clothing, the very foundation of survival. A single careless ember could undo months of preparation. The weight of stone promised permanence, but permanence came at a cost. Stone houses were rare for peasants, but castles, bridges, and walls loomed over the medieval world. Castles were designed for survival in times of war. Yet inside their walls, life could be suffocating. When siege engines battered at the gates, defenders huddled within, cut off from fields and supplies. Stone walls that had once offered safety now became prisons. Sieges could last weeks or months. Hunger gnawed at those trapped inside. Wells sometimes ran dry. Disease spread quickly in crowded conditions. Even in peacetime, stone carried risks. Buildings collapsed under their own weight when poorly constructed. Bridges washed away in floods, taking travelers with them. A stone church, struck by lightning, could crumble, burying worshippers beneath rubble. So stone, for all its strength, was never truly invincible. The cost of engineering. Every survival technique came with its cost. Mills, though efficient, often belonged to the lord or the church. Peasants were required to bring their grain there, paying fees to have it ground. Some even faced punishment for using hand querns at home, because lords feared losing revenue. Stone ovens, too, were often communal, overseen by the manor. Families paid to bake their bread, adding yet another burden to already thin resources. What had once been survival tools, watermills, ovens, strong walls, could also become instruments of control. Technology, even in its simplest form, carried power. The ever-present fear. Because of these dangers, medieval life carried an undercurrent of anxiety. People prayed for rain, but not too much rain. They tended fires carefully, yet still feared them at night. They relied on stone walls, yet worried about what would happen if enemies came. Every survival method was fragile. None were perfect. And so, resilience meant not just building wells, mills, or hearths. It meant living with uncertainty. Adapting to the risks. Still, medieval people adapted. Villages built levees to protect against floods. Some towns banned thatched roofs, requiring tiles or wooden shingles instead. Stone buildings were reinforced with buttresses to reduce collapse. These measures were not foolproof, but they revealed a mindset shaped by survival. People accepted that danger could not be erased, only managed. Survival's double edge, and so each element revealed its double nature. Water gave life, but could drown. Fire warmed the home, but could consume it. Stone gave shelter, but could trap or collapse. To live in the Middle Ages was to accept this double edge, to keep faith that the same forces that destroyed might also sustain. The question that remains. But this balance raises a question. If survival tools carried so much risk, Why did medieval people continue to rely on them so heavily? Why did they not seek entirely new methods? Or was their resilience precisely in learning to live with danger rather than trying to escape it?
The air became precious. Rosemary, juniper, and sage were burned in homes, filling rooms with smoke and fragrance. Garlic and onions were eaten raw, believed to protect against poisoned air. Vinegar was used to wash hands and soak sponges, which some carried before their faces. Though these remedies could not stop plague itself, some may have helped in small ways. Vinegar had mild antibacterial properties. Burning herbs might drive away insects. Garlic truly does contain compounds that fight bacteria. Yet, in the scale of epidemic disease, such protections were fragile. Still, they gave people a sense of action, and in survival, that sense mattered. Fever and the cooling of the body fever was one of the most common medieval illnesses, and one of the most feared. When someone burned with heat, families turned to cooling herbs. Willow bark was steeped, which contained the same compound that would later inspire aspirin. Mint was brewed into teas. Cool cloths were laid on the brow, sometimes soaked in vinegar or rosewater. These remedies did not cure infection, but they soothed and sometimes lowered fevers just enough to allow survival. Wounds and infections. The risk of infection haunted every injury. Farmers cut by tools, soldiers pierced by blades, children scratched by animals. All faced the danger of festering wounds. Herbs like yarrow, comfrey, and honey were pressed into cuts. Honey, in particular, had antibacterial qualities, though medieval people did not understand why. They simply knew it worked. Poultices, warm, moist masses of herbs or bread, were laid on wounds to draw out bad humours. Sometimes the practice helped, ... Sometimes it introduced more harm. Yet families tried again and again because doing nothing meant certain risk. The border between medicine and magic, it is difficult to separate medieval medicine from magic. Remedies often included charms, whispered words, or actions timed with the phases of the moon. A wound might be bound with yarrow while a rhyme was spoken. A fever might be treated with herbs gathered at dawn in silence, believed to carry greater strength. To the medieval mind, there was no clear division. Herbs held power not only because of their taste or smell, but because of the rituals surrounding them. Healing was both material and spiritual, both leaf and prayer. And perhaps that belief gave strength. Comfort and hope are not cures in themselves, but they can sustain the will to live. And survival often depended on that will. Knowledge carried in memory, what is most striking is how fragile this knowledge was. In villages, remedies were rarely written. They lived in memory, in the voices of women who had watched and learned, in the habits of families who had seen which plants helped and which did not. Monks wrote books, yes, but peasants remembered through practice. A girl helping her mother gather chamomile, a boy learning where the yarrow grew thickest. Knowledge lived not in parchment, but in fields and hands, and because of this, much of it has been lost. Some plants used then are no longer identified today. Some practices, though mocked as superstition, may have had value now forgotten. The quiet question. So we are left with a question. Were these remedies survival tools in themselves? Or were they survival because they carried community, memory, and belief? Was it the plant that healed, or the care with which it was given? Section 3. Legacies of Healing and the Memory of Survival. In the long shadow of the Middle Ages, much was forgotten. The castles remain, the churches endure, the records of kings and wars fill the chronicles. But the everyday acts of healing, the teas, the poultices, the whispered prayers, are harder to find. They lived not in stone or parchment, but in memory, and memory fades, yet traces remain. Small clues that tell us how medieval people sought to survive illness in a world without modern medicine. Remedies that endured. Some medieval cures survived the centuries, carried quietly into later ages. Chamomile tea, still sipped today for rest and calm, was once a common household remedy. Willow bark, boiled for fevers and pain, became the foundation for aspirin. Honey, laid on wounds, is still recognized for its antibacterial properties. Garlic, eaten raw or steeped, continues to be valued for its ability to fight infection. These simple plants reveal that medieval knowledge was not empty superstition. It was observation repeated across generations, tested by survival itself. Families remembered what worked because forgetting could cost lives. Remedies that were lost, other cures, however, have slipped away. Manuscripts mention plants no longer clearly identified. Names changed over centuries, and some herbs once common have vanished from fields. Some practices are dismissed as mere magic, carrying charms, muttering rhymes, or placing herbs at thresholds to guard against spirits. And yet, we cannot fully know their value. Perhaps some were only comfort. Perhaps others had effects now obscured by time. Survival does not always leave a clear record. Much of it vanishes like smoke from a fire. The social power of healing. What mattered most was not only the plant, but the act of care to brew tea for a sick child, to press a poultice against a wound, to sit by a bedside through the night. These acts bound families together, gave strength to endure. The herbwife or wise woman held power not only because she knew the plants, but because she gave people hope. Even when her remedies failed, she offered the comfort of trying. Survival was never just physical. It was emotional, communal, spiritual, from cottage to monastery to medicine. In monasteries, remedies were recorded, refined, and sometimes passed into the larger tradition of European medicine. Learned physicians debated humours and treatments, but their libraries were filled with knowledge first gathered by peasants in fields. Later, as science grew, these fragments of medieval practice were examined, tested, and transformed. What began as a grandmother's memory became, in some cases, the seed of modern pharmacology. The line from medieval herb garden to modern pharmacy is not straight, but it exists. The uncertainty they lived with, even with these remedies, illness often claimed lives. Mothers buried children, husbands lost wives, entire villages were sometimes struck by plague. Survival was never guaranteed. Remedies eased pain, but they could not erase death. Yet people did not stop trying. They gathered herbs each spring, dried them each summer, prepared them each autumn, and trusted them each winter. The cycle continued year after year because the will to survive was stronger than despair. Lessons for us today, surrounded by hospitals, vaccines, and antibiotics, it is easy to forget how fragile survival once was. But the medieval story of healing reminds us that survival is not only about science or certainty, it is about persistence, about the willingness to act even when the outcome is unsure. A simple cup of chamomile tea, a poultice of honey, a prayer whispered by firelight. None of these guaranteed life, but they gave strength. They gave people something to hold on to in times of fear. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson, that survival often lies in the smallest acts, the ordinary rituals of care, rather than in grand cures, rather than permanent homes. They dug drainage ditches and constructed levees. Over centuries, these early experiments grew into more advanced systems of water management, canals, sluice gates, and embankments. Even today, engineers study the patterns of ancient waterways. Many European cities still sit where medieval people once judged it safe to settle. Their choices, cautious, practical, sometimes boring, proved lasting. And in the simple act of turning a stream's power into steady work through mills, they planted the seed for later revolutions. Water wheels inspired mechanical thinking that would one day drive industry, fire and the birth of precaution. The medieval fear of fire gave rise to a slow but steady shift in building practice. After repeated town-wide disasters, authorities introduced rules. No open flames near thatch, no unattended ovens, no storage of flammable goods in crowded markets. Gradually, roofs of tile replaced roofs of straw. Chimneys were designed to draw smoke more efficiently. Streets widened in some places to create fire breaks. These were small, almost invisible changes, but they were survival measures learned from bitter experience. The legacy is clear. Today's fire codes, extinguishers, and even the concept of fire brigades have roots in medieval attempts to control the ever-present risk of flame. Out of destruction grew precaution, and out of fear, responsibility. Stone and the idea of permanent stone was both a burden and a gift. Heavy, unyielding, difficult to shape, yet it carried the promise of endurance. Medieval castles and churches taught later generations that human effort could outlast centuries, even if imperfectly. Stone walls against siege revealed both the limits and strengths of defense. Though no fortress was truly impenetrable, the effort to build them gave rise to new architecture. Buttresses, vaulted ceilings, fortified bridges. These designs carried forward, influencing cities long after the age of knights and lords ended. The lesson of stone was not invincibility, but persistence. That survival is not found in avoiding risk entirely, but in building with what one has, however imperfect the material, the mindset of balance. At the heart of these survival methods lies a medieval mindset, one less about control and more about balance. Medieval people did not expect certainty. They accepted the possibility of failure, even as they prepared for success. To draw water was to accept flood. To kindle fire was to accept risk of flame. To build in stone was to accept collapse as a possibility. This constant awareness gave their lives a rhythm of caution and resilience. Perhaps it made their world feel heavy, at times oppressive. But it also gave them a resilience that allowed their communities to endure for centuries. Echoes in the present, though we live in modern times. We are not so different. Floods still strike towns. Fires still sweep through communities. Buildings still collapse. But the medieval people left us more than ruins. They left a way of thinking. Their small, cautious innovations, the ditch, the chimney, the arch, all form part of our present survival. What feels boring? The steady turn of a water, wheel, ... the careful thatching of a roof, the regular tending of a fire, was in truth the quiet work of survival, the quiet heroism of the ordinary. We often remember kings, battles, or grand discoveries. But survival in the Middle Ages was shaped by ordinary hands, millers, masons, bakers, and villagers. It was the peasant who carried buckets of water to stop a fire, the carpenter who rebuilt a bridge after a flood, the mason who placed stone upon stone until a wall stood firm. Their work was rarely recorded, yet without them, history itself could not have continued. The legacy of survival belongs as much to them as to any monarch or knight. Closing reflection. So, when we think of medieval survival, we may imagine violence or heroism, but perhaps the truer story lies in balance, in the way water, fire, and stone, both friend and enemy, shaped daily life. The Middle Ages remind us that survival is not dramatic, ... It is steady, repetitive, often dull. It is found in digging ditches, tending embers, stacking stones, and maybe in remembering their quiet persistence, we find a lesson for our own lives. That survival, even today, does not always lie in grand leaps forward, but in patience, in resilience, and in learning to live with risk, rather than imagining we can escape it. And so, ... as the story of water, fire, and stone draws to a close, the question lingers. Do we still remember that our survival rests not in conquering nature, but in learning quietly to live beside it? Story 3. Quiet Cures. Herbal Remedies and Forgotten Medical Survival Tricks. Section 1. Healing in a World Without Doctors. When we picture the Middle Ages, it is easy to imagine sickness everywhere. ... The damp cottages, the crowded towns, The lack of clean water. Illness was constant. Coughs, fevers, stomach pains, infections. In a time before modern medicine, even the smallest wound could threaten a life. Yet, despite this, people endured. They found ways to heal, ways to ease pain, ways to survive. And often their tools were not the polished instruments of scholars or physicians. They were plants growing in hedgerows, herbs drying in cottages, and knowledge passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter. Healing was not always learned in books. It was whispered by firelight, practiced in fields, and remembered in times of need. The role of the herb wife. Every village had someone who knew the plants. Sometimes she was called the herb wife, sometimes simply the wise woman. She might not read or write, but she knew the shapes of leaves, the smell of roots, the places where certain flowers grew. People came to her with everyday troubles: a toothache, a child's cough, a wound from farm work. She would gather plants, grind them into powders, steep them into teas, or crush them into poultices. Her remedies were rarely dramatic. They did not cure plague or banish death, but they soothed, calmed, and strengthened. They helped people endure, and in a world where survival often meant nothing more than making it through the next week, that was enough. Common herbs of survival, some herbs were known across much of Europe, repeated in countless households. Chamomile, a gentle flower, dried and steeped in hot water to calm the stomach, ease restlessness, or help with sleep. Yarrow, with its feathery leaves, used to staunch bleeding when someone was cut in the fields. Garlic, sharp and pungent, believed to fight infection and even ward off bad air. Rosemary and thyme, fragrant herbs, added not only to food but also to washes, meant to keep away illness. These plants were humble, but they were survival tools. Families gathered them in spring and summer, dried them carefully, and stored them for winter, when fevers and colds were worst. Rituals and remedies healing was never only physical. Remedies often carried a touch of ritual, shaped by faith and fear. A charm might be spoken while laying a poultice. A cross might be traced over a wound. A prayer whispered as herbs were boiled. Such rituals may seem superstitious to us, but for medieval people, healing was never separated from the spiritual. Illness was often seen as both a physical affliction and a sign of imbalance, perhaps even a test from God. To treat it, one needed both medicine and faith. Monastic knowledge. Not all remedies were held in cottages. Monasteries preserved written records of herbs and their uses. Monks cultivated gardens filled with medicinal plants: sage, mint, lavender, fennel. They copied manuscripts like the Physica of Hildegard of Bingen or the Herbarium of Apuleius, which listed plants and their virtues. But even this knowledge was not far removed from the simple herbwife's craft. Learned monks and ordinary villagers alike turned to the same plants, the same leaves, the same roots. What differed was the formality of the record, not the substance of survival. The fragility of health, even with herbs. Healing was never certain. A wound might fester. A fever might grow worse. Remedies helped, but they could not always save. Families lived with this uncertainty, just as they lived with the risks of water, fire, and stone. Yet what mattered was the attempt, the willingness to try, the sense that even in sickness something could be done, that a mother could comfort her child with chamomile tea, that a farmer could bind his cut with yarrow, ... that a family could feel they were not powerless. The unresolved question, but this raises a thought. Were these remedies truly effective, or did their power lie in the belief they inspired? Did medieval people survive because the herbs healed them, or because the comfort of ritual and care gave strength to endure illness?
Story is not one of glory, but of persistence. The shape of the village. Most medieval villages were built with defense in mind, even if they looked humble. Houses were clustered together, not spread too far apart. Narrow lanes allowed neighbors to watch who came and went. At the center, there was often a church, built in stone, stronger than the cottages. In times of attack, families might run there, huddling inside as the heavy doors closed. Around the edges of the village, hedges and ditches sometimes served as barriers. These were not strong walls, but they slowed intruders. A ditch filled with water or lined with thorn bushes was a simple but effective deterrent. The role of the church as refuge. The village church was more than a place of worship. It was often the only stone building for miles, with thick walls and narrow windows. In times of danger, it became a fortress of sorts. Families crowded inside, bringing children, tools, and sometimes even livestock. Priests locked the doors, and villagers prayed for safety. Bandits might steal from empty cottages, but the church often stood firm. Though it was not designed for battle, it became the heart of survival. Watchfulness as defense. Defense was not always about walls or weapons. It was about awareness. Villages kept watch over their fields and roads. Children played at the edges of settlements, their eyes sharp for strangers. Shepherds on hills became early warning systems, spotting raiders from afar. Bells rang in the church tower to signal alarm. A community could gather quickly, not to fight like soldiers, but to hide, to guard, to protect. The defense was not aggressive. It was cautious, quiet, designed to preserve life rather than to win glory. Household defenses. Even single cottages had their small defenses. Doors were thick, made from oak when possible, barred with heavy beams at night. Windows were small, often just slits covered with shutters. Inside, tools that served daily work could also become weapons if needed. A scythe, a hammer, a pitchfork. These were not forged in armories, but they could defend a family in desperation. The fire on the hearth could be spread to create smoke or flames, deterring intruders. Even boiling water, poured from above, was a humble but fierce defense. Collective strength. Most importantly, defense was collective. A single peasant family stood little chance against armed raiders, but when a village acted together, raising alarms, closing ranks, helping neighbors, survival became possible. It was not about defeating the enemy, but about enduring the threat. To make an attack costly enough that raiders might move on, to protect what could be saved, and to rebuild what was lost. This collective spirit was the essence of survival. The lingering question. But this raises a thought. Were these defenses truly enough, or were they only temporary measures delaying the inevitable? Did ordinary people find real safety in their simple fortifications, or did survival always depend on the mercy or indifference of those with greater power? Section 2. Facing raids and warfare. When we think about danger in the medieval world, it is tempting to picture vast armies, banners waving, soldiers marching, horses galloping. But for the average villager, the most common threat did not come from great battles. It came in the form of raids. Raids were sudden, swift, and terrifying. They could be carried out by bandits, by rival lords, or even by foreign invaders testing the borderlands. They did not linger long. They came to steal, to burn, to frighten, and then to vanish. And yet, even a short raid could undo years of labor for ordinary people. The terror of the unexpected. Imagine tending your sheep in the meadow or carrying water from the stream when suddenly the church bells begin to ring. A warning spreads from lips to lips and panic grows. Horses thunder down the track or footsteps break the quiet fields. Shouts rise, doors slam, and children are gathered in haste. Some run toward the church, some toward the woods. Others freeze, uncertain whether to flee or hide. The speed of the raid was its greatest weapon. Villagers had little time to decide, little chance to resist. Retreat into nature. For many, survival meant disappearing into the landscape itself. Forests, marshes, and caves became places of refuge. Villagers knew their land better than any outsider. They knew which streams were shallow, which thickets could conceal a family, which paths twisted in ways that confused strangers. Hiding was not cowardice. It was wisdom. To melt into the woods with your children and your animals was often the surest defense. By the time raiders passed through, you might return to find your cottage ransacked, but at least you had lived. Fire as a weapon and a fear. In raids, fire was both the weapon of attackers and the tool of defenders. Raiders often set homes alight, knowing that thatch burned quickly and smoke spread fear. But villagers, too, sometimes used fire to slow enemies. Burning brush piles could create barriers. Smoke could obscure vision. In desperate moments, even torches could become defensive tools, wielded against invaders in narrow lanes. The power of fire was double-edged, protecting and destroying at the same time. The siege of small places. Sometimes the danger lasted longer than a single raid. Small villages could be trapped in drawn-out struggles when rival lords fought nearby. Armies marching through the land demanded food, shelter, and service. Villagers might barricade themselves in the church or gather at a manor house if one existed. They rationed grain, guarded wells, and endured sleepless nights. These small sieges were not recorded in great chronicles, yet they shaped daily life. The memory of hunger, the fear of forced labor, the sight of fields trampled under soldiers' boots, all became part of survival. Negotiation and submission. Another form of defense was not built of wood or stone, but of words. When faced with overwhelming force, villagers sometimes turned to negotiation. They offered food, ale, or livestock to raiders in exchange for safety. They bowed to passing lords, paying small tributes in hopes of mercy. It was not glorious, and it was not always successful. But survival often meant swallowing pride and making compromises. For ordinary people, negotiation was a shield as much as any wall. Children and elders' defense was not only about men with tools in their hands. Women, children, and elders played roles too. Children acted as lookouts, their sharp eyes quick to spot riders from afar. Elders offered wisdom, recalling safe paths, hidden shelters, or lessons from earlier raids. Women carried water, tended the wounded, and guarded the hearth. They moved livestock to safety, soothed frightened little ones, and sometimes stood in defense themselves. Survival was a family effort, woven across generations. The lasting memory of fear. Even after raiders left, the village carried scars. Burned homes, stolen goods, empty fields. Sometimes the loss was not material, but emotional. The fear lingered. Children remembered the sound of bells, the sight of flames, the cries of neighbors. Adults carried the weight of rebuilding, season after season. The past was never truly gone, for every new threat revived the memory of the last. The question that remains. And so we ask, did these repeated raids strengthen the will of ordinary people, teaching them endurance? Or did they wear down their spirits, slowly draining hope across the years?
Thatched roofs with straw. Men split timber and dug posts into the earth. Within weeks, a home could rise again where only charred ground had been. This rhythm of rebuilding was not seen as extraordinary. It was expected. Loss and repair were part of the same fabric of life. Community as a wall. What truly defended the village was not wood or stone, but people themselves. The bonds of obligation, of shared memory, of cooperation. When one family fell, others helped them stand again. Grain was shared when harvests were thin, tools were borrowed and returned. Even in poverty, a sense of duty held communities together. This invisible wall was often stronger than any ditch or hedge. For an attacker, the real challenge was not just breaking doors, but breaking the unity of neighbors. And that unity, though tested, endured traditions of watchfulness. Generations passed down the memory of danger. Children were told stories of raids, not as entertainment, but as warnings. Always listen for the bells, ... Always keep an eye on the road, ... Never leave the livestock too far from the village, ... These sayings shaped habits. They made caution a part of daily life. Defense became less about sudden action and more about constant awareness. Faith and refuge, the church again and again stood as the last refuge. Its bells gave warning. Its walls gave shelter. Its priest gave comfort. For many, survival was explained not just in human effort, but in divine will. Prayers were offered in thanksgiving after raids. Crosses were carved into new doors. Saints' days were celebrated not only for joy, but for protection. Faith and defense were intertwined. To survive was to endure by God's grace as much as by human strength. The quiet heroes. Most of these acts of defense were never written down. Chroniclers recorded the deeds of kings, battles of armies, treaties of lords. But the quiet heroism of a mother leading children into the forest, or an old man keeping watch at the edge of the fields, or neighbors rebuilding a burned home. These stories rarely found parchment, yet they were the real foundation of survival. Without them, there would be no villages left to tax, no fields left to harvest, no lives left to govern. Memory as a weapon. In time, memory itself became a form of defense. Villages remembered the paths raiders took, the tricks that saved them, the mistakes that cost them. If raiders struck from the north one year, lookouts watched the northern road more closely the next. If a fire spread too quickly through thatch, roofs were rebuilt with thicker clay beneath the straw. Each generation improved, however slightly, upon the last. Defense was not static. It was a slow, quiet evolution, shaping identity. All of this, the watchfulness, the rebuilding, the faith, the memory became part of how ordinary people saw themselves. They were not warriors, yet they survived. They were not lords, yet they endured the decisions of lords. They were not chroniclers, yet they carried history in their bones. The identity of a village was forged less by victories and more by persistence. Survival was their story, passed not in books, but in customs, habits, and whispered warnings. The last reflection, and so we return to the question: did these small defences truly protect them, or did they merely teach them to live with constant risk? Were the hedges, the bells, the watchful eyes enough? Or was survival always a fragile balance between danger and resilience? Perhaps the true strength of ordinary medieval people was not in weapons or walls, but in their acceptance. They did not expect safety to be perfect. They expected hardship and met it with endurance. And in that endurance, they left us a quiet lesson that survival, even when humble, can be powerful. Story 5. Surviving the Hungry Months, Medieval Strategies for Winter and Famine. Section 1. The long wait for spring in the medieval world. Winter was not only a season of cold, ... It was a season of hunger. Fields lay barren beneath frost. Rivers froze. Herds thinned. Days were short, and nights seemed endless. For ordinary people, peasants, farmers, labourers, survival through winter was the greatest test of the year. There was no grocery market stocked with goods from distant lands, no refrigerated stores of fruit and meat, no quick deliveries to fill empty cupboards. Whatever food you had by the end of autumn was what you would rely upon until spring returned. This harsh reality shaped medieval life more than battles or politics. It dictated rhythms of work, traditions of feast and fast, and strategies of preservation that are often forgotten today. The harvest as the deciding factor. The entire year revolved around harvest. If the autumn harvest was plentiful, the village entered winter with hope. Barns were filled, granaries sealed, root cellars stocked with turnips, carrots, and onions. But if the harvest failed, from drought, flood, or blight, the coming months carried dread. People measured out every loaf of bread, every handful of grain, knowing that what was eaten today might mean starvation tomorrow. The line between abundance and famine was as thin as the stalk of a single wheat plant. Storing grain was life. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, each was stored with care. Grain kept in wooden bins or clay-lined pits could last for months if guarded from moisture and pests. Rats and mice were constant enemies, gnawing at the precious stores. Villagers set traps, kept cats, and sometimes even built granaries on raised stilts to keep rodents at bay. Every ear of grain was precious. A single bag of wheat could mean the difference between bread on the table and a winter of hunger. Preserving meat and fish. Fresh meat did not last long. Without refrigeration, villagers relied on preservation. Salting, smoking, and drying were the most common methods. Fish caught in summer rivers was salted and stored in barrels. Pork was smoked in huts where fires burned slowly for days. Even eels were considered valuable winter food, wriggling in muddy ponds until caught and eaten. Salt itself was a treasure, expensive, sometimes worth nearly its weight in silver. To have salt meant security, to lack it meant risk. Root cellars and hidden stores. Beneath the earth, cool and dark, villagers kept root vegetables. Turnips, cabbages, parsnips, and onions were buried in pits or stored in clay jars. Some families layered straw over their stores, insulating them from frost. This simple technology meant survival. Without root crops, bread alone would not be enough. Families sometimes kept secret stores, hidden caches of grain or beans buried away from common barns. These private reserves could save a household in times of need, though they could also create suspicion among neighbors. The rhythm of fasting. In many regions, the church calendar provided a structure for eating less. Days of fasting, such as Lent, were observed with limited meals and plain foods. For the poor, fasting was not only religious, it was practical. It allowed supplies to stretch further. Feast days, when they came, were rare moments of abundance. But even these were measured against the looming shadow of scarcity. The hungry gap. The worst time was not the deep midwinter, but the months before spring's first harvest. This period, often called the hungry gap, stretched through late winter into early spring. By then, stored grain was low. Root vegetables had withered. Salted meat was nearly gone. The new crops were not yet ready to harvest. Families survived on thin gruel, boiled weeds, or bread mixed with ground beans or acorns. It was a time of weakness, when illness spread more icily and spirits grew weary. Hope for spring, yet spring always came. The thaw of rivers, the return of green shoots, the first lambs born in the meadows. The relief of spring was not only physical, but spiritual. Surviving the hungry months was proof of endurance, of patience, of strength against hardship. Still, one wonders, how many families saw spring as a promise, and how many saw it as a reminder of what they had lost in winter's shadow.